Hey everybody, welcome to episode 25 of Pealed's LiveCast Conversations with, as always, I'm your host, Gene Bernier, and on today's show, we have Sue Ross. Sue is a coach, a strategic advisor, a connector, and a business developer. She helps growth-obsessed CEOs manage and to develop smarter, more effective leadership strategies and ways to scale their operations so they can achieve the personal and professional growth they desire. Sue has an incredible background in corporate leadership with companies like Disney Online Studios and Starbucks. She left the corporate world to pursue her own tech-enabled startup and has held leadership roles with other tech companies. She's also led national social enterprise initiatives and has a passion for helping other founders grow their businesses through mindful leadership and as a certified emotional intelligence coach. She believes that if you want to be a more effective leader, if you want to lead your team to higher profits, greater efficiencies, faster growth, or any other business goal, you need to approach your leadership from a whole person standpoint. She recently launched Evolved EQ, an 8-week emotional intelligence intensive for CEOs, startup founders, executive leaders, sales leaders, and mid and senior managers who want to build a focused, resilient team of high-performing employees. There are 3 intake sessions per year, January, May, and September, and each is limited to 12 participants. Sue, my words here cannot do justice to all the incredible things that you're doing. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me, Gene. It's a pleasure to be on here with you.
Oh, yes. Well, that's a pleasure is all mine. So again, thank you. So tell us a little bit about yourself. I know that intro says a lot, but where are you at? And as with all these conversations, I love to start journeying back and seeing how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, I think it goes back even as early as my childhood, and the desire or the passion I had to play, maybe a little bit more unconventional games when I was a kid. I wasn't really interested in Barbies and Lego and that kind of stuff, traditional kid toys. I opted for playing office and grocery store with my siblings. My dad brought home an old cash register once from one of his jobs, and so we just collected a whole bunch of old recycling cans and boxes and stuff, and we created an epic store. Or
Yeah.
I'd take my mom's mail and redistribute it to her later. I'm sure she loved getting the bills twice. So yeah.
So there was a part of an entrepreneurship that was like baked into that play then, is from what I'm hearing, is you loved creating and loved providing value to people.
Right. That's really the case. Yeah. And it started from a young age too. I mean, I kind of moved up. I started working with Blockbuster early days in my late teens and early 20s, and quickly went from, like movie store jockey, like, shelving old movies and stuff, to being promoted straight into a management role within that organization as well. And I enjoyed that for a number of years. And, I'm really grateful for the fact that I had really strong mentors from a very young age. And that first mentor I had was at Blockbuster. He was one of my bosses, and then he ended up, growing with the organization as well, and led a district. And, it was through his trust in me and his belief in me and his guidance that really kind of set the stage for who I want, or how I wanted to show up in a leadership role as I was, progressing through the various roles that I held with those other organizations like Disney and Starbucks.
Right. That's really interesting. How you talked about he helped you set the stage for all that, right? And it's incredible to have those solid mentors at that early parts of your career to help guide you and be like, hey, this is what that could look like for you.
Definitely. And I can't stress enough the importance of either mentorship or coaching, or, some, guidance in some sort of capacity, because I find it really helps. It helps us identify our blind spots. And so it was through those experiences or those interactions and conversations with him that yeah, I've been able to kind of take that with me forward into all of my experiences
Yeah.
in entrepreneurship and in leadership roles. Mm-hmm.
And being, being young back then too, sometimes that those messages aren't always so heard. We're a little bit, well, teenagers can be a little on the challenging side to get the messages through. So to be able
Yeah.
to have delivered it in a way that could be heard, there had to be some form of like a trust there with him to be able to hear what he was saying and take that and apply it. And now watching that advice from Blockbuster days, how that's guided you through where you are today, doing your own coaching through emotional intelligence and stuff. It's like
Mm-hmm.
it kind of planted some seeds that maybe he wasn't even aware he was planting.
I wasn't even aware that he was planting those seeds. When I worked at Blockbuster and Starbucks, I didn't actually have a desire to be a manager or a leader of people. My original goals when I went into my first year of college was to be a translator for the UN, and life choices make their appearances, or opportunities for different choices arise, and so then I found myself really kind of diving into that world of leadership. So yeah, you don't really know. It's hard to know what the future has in store for you sometimes.
Oh, big time. Oh,
Mhm.
100%. Have there been other mentors along the way that have had that type of impact on you? Or has it been more of a build on top of that set of values that were exposed?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gene. I've definitely been impacted positively by a number of um, strong, you know, uh, just above board people. But that first manager was just he really kind of set the bar high in terms of just, yeah, how he led his teams, not just me. And I think all of the other people that I've worked with since then have just kind of added to that, and
Right.
yeah, no, definitely.
It's interesting. As you're saying that, uh, I can relate to that, knowing that there's one very specific manager back in my early days that I tie a lot of where I'm at today and the way I operate based on some conversations he had with me, like in the hall or going in and out of meetings. They weren't even like focus time. It was just like you deliver a gem and you didn't even realize until like years later, be like, oh, that's what he did. And maybe he's just a ninja and knew exactly what he was doing, or else just randomly handed those seeds out and they've turned into something cool.
Yeah, it's kind of like parenting, right? Like you hope that the lessons that you're going to instill on your kids are going to, sink in there somewhere in the depths of their brain. And, we have these aha moments when we're adults. We're like, oh my goodness, like my parents actually were right about this thing.
Those are the good moments that should happen, and I'm sure that we've all as well had in in parenting and in business life. Gone, oh my lord! I just heard my I've heard my mother and my father come out of my mouth before. I'm just like, oh God, good lord. That I recognize what's happening from an outside perspective now,
Totally.
and that shows up in all forms of leadership.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I would say that the most pivotal moment for me in my journey has really been over the last 5 years, where I started to deepen into my own emotional intelligence and how I was showing up in the world. And so like the emotional intelligence side of things wasn't really a focus for me when I held leadership roles. Um, and yeah, and so over the last 5 years, I've been able to kind of dive deeper into that, and it's been a really interesting journey learning about what emotional intelligence is, and how it's different from IQ or personality. And yeah, it's been a really interesting journey.
Well, for somebody who's watching this at some point in the future and has never heard, well, they've never heard about emotional intelligence or the comparison between IQ and EQ, how would you describe that to them?
Yeah, it's so when we think about IQ, it's really more about, how we categorize information in our brains. It's kind of like the space that our that the information takes up in our brain, and how we, catalog it, and like it's kind of IQ is largely kind of set and established by the time we're in our early 20s, like late teens kind of thing. And it doesn't really change that much over time. It declines a little bit in older age. Whereas, and then on the personality side of things, personality is really more about how we, it's about like the characteristics, like, how we are and show up in the world, right? For example, if we're more extroverted or introverted, or if we're soft spoken, or if we're like straight shooters, that really, those kind of pieces dictate your personality. And again, those don't change that much either throughout your adulthood. But EQ, which is what I like, the reason why I love EQ so much is because EQ is all about your like this set of social and emotional skills that we all have, and the way that we utilize those social and emotional skills to help make decisions and express ourselves and interact with others, and the way that we deal with stress, or the way that we perceive ourselves as well, right? And our EQ score. So EI and EQ are kind of used interchangeably, right?
Okay.
EI is emotional intelligence, but then if you're assessed, you get an EQ score, right? And your EQ score is it's not a static number. It doesn't really, your EQ can change and grow over time. The more willing and receptive you are to improving in certain areas of emotional intelligence. So that's what I love about EQ, is it's just not a static number, and it's not just like, okay, well, I'm an introvert or an extrovert, kind of thing. It's like, okay, well, I've got this set of skills, and now what can I do with it to hone it and make it work more effectively for me in the interactions I have.
And it's, I've heard like Gary Vee talk about where he says EQ is outweighs and outperforms IQ every single day, especially in his organization. So,
yeah.
And when I hear you talk about it, that's that one thing, like you can work on it every single day, and you have an opportunity to strengthen it. And I'd assume there's always going to be some form of a blind spot within it, but you can continue to evolve it, right? Or that EQ, you take that scan, you get that number. It's a snapshot in time, and it's not a destiny, if that makes sense. Like where like an EQ is, like we're talking about that earlier, where it's kind of set. Like there's only so much you're going to be able to push through it. But with an EQ, you're able to grow it if you put the work in, or potentially, I guess, even shrink it if you don't. And it's something to be more aware of.
Yeah, exactly. And, EQ and IQ really do pair well together. I mean, you don't have to have a super high IQ in order to be highly emotionally intelligent, but the two do complement each other to an extent. But there are studies that do back up what Gary Vee says, right? That EQ definitely far outweighs the IQ. Yeah.
So you said this journey for you, going down this emotional intelligence journey, it's kind of been like started in the last 5 years. Like, what was it that kind of made you go have either an aha moment or start down this journey?
Yeah. So it started with, the kind of what I like to call the catalyst for this journey was a trip, my first solo vacation to Costa Rica back in on Christmas Day. I arrived in Costa Rica on Christmas Day 2015, and I spent 2.5 weeks traveling around Costa Rica by myself. And while the trip itself was just, a fantastic experience, and I met awesome people, and I, pushed myself in ways that I'd never pushed myself before, I found myself profoundly alone and just very isolated and so far away from my friends and family and just everything I knew. And when I returned home from this vacation, this trip, everything crumbled around me. I started experiencing a lot of anxiety and stress. And I'd been through a very stressful period in the 4 years prior to that. And so I kind of feel like this trip was like, it was an opportunity for me to, kind of take a step back and, take a breath and, really be alone and allow me to kind of heal whatever needed to be healed from, the prior years. And, so when I got back, I was basically a shell of myself. I had to go on, like a medical leave of absence for 15 weeks from the full-time job that I had at the time. And I didn't actually end up returning to that job. And instead, withdrew all my investments, and I lived off of my investments for 6 months and kind of started to launch a consulting business with a good friend and business partner, after the first few months. And it was through this experience that I had to kind of start looking at how I was, how I perceive myself. So emotional intelligence, I'm going to kind of take a back step for a second in this story and just explain that, so emotional intelligence is comprised of 5 like essential realms, right? If you think about it. And so each of those realms are self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal decision-making, and stress management. And there are 3 kind of subcomponents for each of those main areas that make up 15 basically kind of elements of emotional intelligence. So
Right.
through this personal experience that I had, I realized that I was lacking, or like, I use the word lacking, but I think the probably more positive way of saying it would be, I realized that I had a lot of opportunity presented to me to enhance my, the way that I was dealing with my stress, like, so my flexibility and my optimism, and even things around self-perception, like self-regard and, my emotional self-awareness. And even how I was showing up with others in different ways. Right. And so through that really pivotal experience in 2016, I went on a massive journey to deepen into mindfulness training, and then EQ kind of just naturally evolved from that. So I had an opportunity to meet and work with a certified EQ coach for a few months. And then years later, we kind of reconnected, and he's the one that certified me in this type of training and assessment that I can do now. So yeah, it's been a really exciting and event-filled 5 years for sure.
I would say it definitely sounds like from that trip on for that next while was a very bumpy road, and probably putting it lightly. While you were going through it, the question comes up first that I would hear from somebody else would be like, how did you keep going through it? Because sometimes people will hit that and will crumble and don't even put that next step in front of them to move forward. But you have, and you did.
Yeah. It, that kind of like, not breakdown, but those really transformative experiences, I think, obviously they happen differently and they look different for everyone, right? So I think in my case, I truly did crumble, and everything, like, I kind of hit rock bottom, and so it was through that rock bottom experience, and being surrounded. I was also very grateful to be surrounded by people who could hold space for me, and to just be there for me and hold my hand, or, like in my most anxious moments, basically, right? Like they were there for me. We talk about mentors a lot. So another mentor, that kind of a guide that came into my life at this time, and I know you've met him before as well, but his name's Raul James. And Raul and I were actually roommates at this time, which was really funny because, that's a different story. But he was really, really integral in kind of, holding that space and helping me see that there was another path or another way to be, conducting myself or living my life. And so it was through, like, family and friends, and like, meditation was a really big thing for me, and still is to this day. Like, I swear by meditation as a form of stress management. But yeah, that's really how I kind of dealt with a lot of the a lot of the, those feelings of despair. And also too, I mean, even today, like even now, there are times where, I say like, sometimes I just wish I could go back to like how it was before I had my transformative experience, where like I had the blinders on and I didn't know better. I was doing the best I could with the tools I had. Sometimes it would just feel easier to go back to that. But then I think to myself, I'm like, no, actually, like despite how hard and I don't want to say hard, but despite how challenging or an uphill walk it's been over the past 5 years, it really is so much better, because the richness with which I'm able to approach life now, and the depth of the friendships that I have, and the impact that I've been able to create for other people as well, like totally makes it worth it.
Oh yeah, it's putting that hard. You make a choice about, you can either do the hard stuff now and live life a little bit easier down the road, or you can do the easy stuff and watch that hard stuff get really difficult when you're older and maybe not with so much energy. It is incredible what can happen when you push through those roadblocks that you have, and it's just like, this feels so difficult. It's like I always refer to it like working out. Be like, your body's going to thank you when you put that work in, and that translates to what I'm hearing about the emotional intelligence. Like your mind is going to thank you. Like my mind, heart, body, and soul are going to thank you for putting that hard work in. Yeah, it may have sucked in the moment, but like, me and my friend talk about earning the grind, right? Like you got to earn it, and when it comes through, you're going to look back and going, oh wow, I can lift that's what used to feel really heavy now is light. Like you can lift it, you can deal with it, and you just have this greater capacity. Now life's going to throw at you what it thinks you can handle, or maybe just a little bit beyond. So you're going to constantly be being pushed. But I just love that. That's the part of the stories that I always like hearing from people, is they got through it and how they did. And the fact they can look back going, I wouldn't change it.
No. Yeah. There's a really great analogy that I picked up from the Headspace app, actually, years ago, or early on in my meditation journey. And it was a visual of, like in terms of, developing new habits, or not even just new habits, but new, thought patterns and self-talk, cycles and stuff like that. And it really stuck with me. And I found this really helpful for a lot of my clients as well, is, when you think of, getting yourself, or, trying to develop a new habit or a new way of thinking or being, you imagine that you're walking down the street, and, up ahead, you see like a hole in the ground, right? And so you're just walking and you're kind of like looking around, and then you fall in the hole, and you're like, oh, this sucks. This doesn't feel very good, right? So you climb out of the hole and you keep on walking. And the next day you do the same thing again. And you might walk into that hole a number of times, but then one day you're walking down the street and you're like, oh, I see that hole. I see it's there. And then and then you get sidetracked or whatever, and you still fall in the hole, even though you were aware of it, right? And then finally, you might do that a few more times until one day you see the hole and you're like, okay, I remember how this feels. This doesn't feel good anymore, right? So then you choose to walk around the hole, and you finally like established a pattern of, or like a new habit that's actually serving you in a positive way. And it's very similar, like, that analogy or that visual is very applicable in a lot of emotional intelligence development as well. Because it takes a lot of time to reform thought patterns and ways of showing up and expressing ourselves in the world. So
yeah, and it's the self-talk component of it is a huge, like, to me, I view that as such a big thing, and how we talk to ourselves, in our head, starts to wire our supercomputer, which is what's driving stepping into that hole all the time. It's just like, it sees it, but you've already in some shape or form said, I kind of want to fall into that hole. So it falls you into that hole until you're like, no, I'm done doing this. I'm done doing this. I'm done doing this. And it takes a lot of repetition to reprogram it, to be able to go, okay, yeah, we're going to walk you around that when you're just off doing the rest of life.
Totally. By far the most important element of emotional intelligence is a person's self-regard. So the more that you can hone in and focus on how you feel about yourself as a human being, all of the other pieces kind of fall into line a little bit easier.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you went that route, because I was going to ask you, like, what is that one big piece? So what is your best piece of like guidance when you start working with somebody, or like best piece of guidance that somebody could take away from this going, I kind of talk to myself like shit. So like, how do I stop that? It sounds great in theory. Mm-hmm. How do they start creating that space to be aware of it and then not beating themselves up for it? Maybe I'm edging that answer a little bit too much, but.
You know, I'll share. I'll start by sharing a story that from another person who had a really positive impact on me years and years ago when I worked at Disney, and we were boarding a flight together, and at the time I hadn't had a lot of experience in airplanes, and I was quite afraid of flying, and I remember just sitting in the airplane, just terrified, waiting for it to take off. And this colleague of mine was sitting near me, or like across the aisle or something, and he saw how shaken up I was about the situation, and he said, Sue, he's like, you just tell yourself, he's like, you say, I used to be afraid of flying, but now I love it, right? Even if you don't believe it right now, just tell yourself that, right? And the more you tell yourself this fact, one day you'll actually start believing it, right? So there is so much power in the idea or the practice of what they call auto-suggestion, right? So if you are telling yourself positive tracks on a regular basis, that's quite often I'll encourage my clients to develop affirmations for themselves that will support the space that they want to be moving into, right? And that it takes time, like you said, you kind of answered some of the elements too, but just to be kind to yourself and always remember, don't make assumptions, do your best always, and your best is going to change from day to day, right? Try not to judge others because it's a reflection of really how we're feeling on the inside about ourselves anyways, right? So, there's that's kind of how I start those types of conversations around building that self-regard, right? So it's a lot of positive self-talk, even if you don't believe it. It's the stories we tell ourselves.
Oh, and we're story-based creatures, and then we turn those into the questions that our subconscious is then out looking for. Be like, how do I support this? How do I support the stories that I keep telling them, that I've told myself?
And you know what? There's another really great. So I have my favorite EQ Bible is the EQ Edge, and there's a foundational exercise that people can take away even today in the show when you're confronted with either a belief that you're experiencing, or some sort of insecurity or fear, or whatever it is. So whenever you have a thought, let's just say, I'm not good on live TV, on live LinkedIn live shows, right? I have terrible stage fright, right? So let's just say that's the belief that or the talk that I'm telling myself. So I would go through this framework. It's called an ABCD framework. There are actually more letters in the framework, but I'm just going to abridge it to the main four. And you ask yourself, first of all, what am I believing to be true right now? What is the story I'm telling myself, right? So I'm not good at LinkedIn Live interviews. So that's the story. And then I start to ask myself, okay, well, where did this belief come from? What's the earliest memory I can think of where this feeling or belief started creeping up, right? Maybe it might have been in my childhood or my young adult years. And so, you don't even need to psychoanalyze it. You just need to pinpoint where in other parts of my history have these thoughts come up. And then finally, or then within that too, what evidence or proof do I have to support that belief? And then finally, you can ask yourself, well, what do I want to believe to be true about this situation? I want to believe that I am vibrant on camera and I am well-spoken and articulate. So then I move into that space and I show up and I do my best, right? So it's through this, like it's really important to start that activity through journaling, like really handwriting it out and going through those, like challenging those beliefs that you have about yourself. But then after a while, it just goes like autopilot. So I find myself, like running through this framework, at least a few times a week if a thought comes up. So
the one thing that's really, like, that whole framework is easy to take away. One thing that jumped out is, like you said, the importance of writing it down.
Yes.
What's the difference between, like, talking it out versus typing it out versus writing it down? Is there a reason that it's more important to write it down?
There are, I'm not going to, there are studies that show that writing things out, like, form the, the little connectors in your brain on a, like, more efficiently than just either typing it out or just going through it in your mind. So there is a lot of power. I can't remember the exact study, but like you could Google search it and it would be like, it's prolific out there, but there's a lot of power in writing things out and journaling as an effective means to, like, solidify new data and new information and habits.
Right. And with the journaling, do you ever go back and look back on it as, like, kind of like a history of, like, oh, that's what I believed, and then 6 months later be like, wow, this is what it's changed to?
Yep, 100%. And I mean, I even had a situation over the past year where I went back and I looked at my journal, like 8 months, like 8 months later from a journal entry. I kind of went back and I remember I had written out this series of I written out something. I don't need to go into details about what it was, but reflecting back on it 9 months later, I was like, oh my goodness, like, and because the things that I was reflecting on, or that I was kind of like trying to envision and bring into my life, those things had actually come into my life, and I had completely forgotten that I had journaled this stuff, right? But those things started to actually take place in my life, and I was blown away by this fact. So journaling is amazing.
Yeah. And is that a habit you do? I guess for me, like, it's kind of diving into the how a little bit, but like, when you have those thoughts, is it more powerful to, like, be writing them down, like having your journal close by, or is that something like you kind of like recap at the end of your day or start of your day, whatever is, the go-to per person?
I firmly believe that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to journaling. I think, because we're all such different creatures, we need to find what works for us. I for a long time, I had a really difficult relationship with journaling. I've been journaling since I was, like, I don't know, 13 or 14, but it used to be like, dear diary, I have a crush on a boy, and oh, why won't he pay attention to me, and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But and then as I became, as I grew older, and really it wasn't until my 30s that I started to actually get a lot more intentional with my journaling. And to be honest, I don't journal every single day. I'm actually diving into bullet journaling this year. That was one of my intentions for this year, was to kind of get all of my thoughts down into just one book. So, because before I had, like, a personal journal where I'd talk about my mindset and the beliefs and, like, all of these different things. And then I'd have a notebook for my work, my goals, my tasks, all of that kind of stuff. So I've kind of amalgamated everything together now to try this, this bullet journaling world. It's a huge world I'm learning. And so far I'm really liking it, because I'm much more, like, my mind works really fast, right? So I want to just be able to get the thought down in kind of like point form a lot of the time, rather than this, like, long-winded, stuff. So I find that's what works for me. But again, I know people who journal every day in the morning before they start their days, or they'll journal at the end of the night to kind of reflect on things. For me, it's much more of an organic process, and it's guided a lot by what I'm experiencing in that particular day or week or month, kind of thing, right? Like, yeah, like this month for me is really all about kind of like creating a foundation for the next, like for the last half of the year, because there's a lot of exciting stuff happening for me in the next 6 months. And so, it's kind of like, I ask myself, like, what are the systems that I need, and who do I need to become? Who do I need to surround myself with in order to, to make this, this next 6 months really successful, kind of thing. Right. So it's a lot of that, but it changes for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that answer, because then it takes that, like, it's just like when people talk, am I meditating the right way? Be like, are you just meditating? Like, there is no right or wrong. It's what you're doing, and it's a growth component to it. And it again, just one more thing that it evolves and changes as you evolve and change, and as your needs kind of like shift a little bit.
Definitely. Yeah. Meditation's the exact same way. There's no one right way to meditate. So yeah.
Just get started, really.
Do it. And allow the thoughts to come into your head, right? Like, some of the most powerful meditations I find are the ones where I'm noting, right? So I'm just sitting there with my eyes closed, and I'm actually paying attention to to what I'm hearing. So if I hear something, in my mind, I'm like, oh, hearing. And if I smell something, I'll note it. I'll be like, smell. And I'll just focus on that stimulus for a few seconds, and then I'll move on to the next stimulus, whether that's the feeling of my breathing, or if it's the feeling of me sitting on the chair, or, whatever it is. And it's also sometimes noting the emotion, like, oh, I'm feeling tired or stressed or whatever. And then I fixate on that feeling for a few seconds, and you basically just moving from stimulus to stimulus for that period of time that you're meditating and in that space. It's really powerful.
Oh yeah. It's kind of teaching yourself not to hold on to it for too long too, right?
100%. If anybody wants to dig in more into that style of meditation, they can Google search Shinzen Young. He's a really powerful meditator, or guru, guide, whatever you want to call it.
Teacher, great meditator. That's awesome. Yeah. So that is all incredible. I'd love to hear about, like, what you're doing with, you talked about you have some intakes around your Evolved EQ sessions and stuff. So what's that looking like? Who are you working directly with, and how can we help spread the word a little bit?
Awesome. Thanks, Gene. So Evolved EQ was born out of the desire to create more impact for people, right? Anybody who manages or leads other people, or it just interacts with people. I mean, we all interact with people, right? And so I feel like I'm on this mission to kind of help people just better show up for themselves. And So Evolved EQ is essentially going to be an 8-week self-study intensive, where we start with an emotional intelligence assessment. And I'll just quickly touch on that emotional intelligence assessment. So the EQI 2.0 assessment is one of the world's only scientifically validated assessments of a person's emotional intelligence. It was made popular. Emotional intelligence in general was made popular back in the mid-90s with Daniel Goleman's emotional intelligence. And he kind of popularized that, and he made his own assessment of emotional intelligence, which is very popular and still very relevant today. But the EQI was based on one of the founding fathers of emotional intelligence, Reuven Bar-On, back in the 80s. So he was a really early thought leader. And essentially what you do, the assessment is you answer 133 questions. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes to complete. And then you're given an EQ score based on like a norm group. And so then that follows up with an hour and a half debrief with the coach, with me, and we kind of go through how you measure up in terms of your emotional intelligence, and then what areas can be honed. And and the fantastic thing about emotional intelligence is that for every single element of emotional intelligence, let's say interpersonal relationships or empathy, for every one of those, so for empathy has 3 other balancing subscales. So if you want to improve on your empathy, then you might actually focus on improving in one of the other 3 areas, like the complementary areas of emotional intelligence, to actually increase your empathy skills. So the Evolved EQ is going to be an 8-week self-study program where you get the assessment and a personal one-on-one debrief with me, and then you launch into a an 8-week program that basically goes through all of the different elements of emotional intelligence, and there'll be like exercises and things that you can do to kind of create your own action plan essentially for how you're going to develop your own emotional intelligence.
That's really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do people get in touch with you and show some interest in this?
Yeah, we're just finishing up the website, the Evolved EQ portion of the website right now. But in the meantime, you can get in touch with me on LinkedIn. I'm Susan Ross or Sue Ross on LinkedIn, or on Instagram at evolved.eq. I'll be sharing lots of fun information and valuable tidbits about all of the elements of emotional intelligence over the coming weeks and months.
That's really awesome. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that success in that program as it launches and does a lot more good. I think the more leaders and more future leaders that we have could plant some of those seeds are going to result in some really good stuff in business.
That's awesome. Well, I'm super excited to dive into that and just have, make a small impact in the greater scheme of things. But there's a real movement going on right now in the world, and I think a lot of people are waking up to the need to pay attention to this kind of development, because it, studies show that that the more you improve upon your emotional intelligence, the greater impact that you can create in your own life and your own business and on your teams as well.
Right.
So,
well, it takes it right back to, from your intro, you talked about the whole person.
Yes,
and that really covers all of that, right? Which then you can show up as a whole person and really be more impactful. So your little seeds, it may be small scale, but the ripple effects are going to be so huge, Sue.
100%. Yeah, definitely.
That's incredible. So as I said, this time is going to fly by. We're already at like 43 minutes on this. So thank you so much for, diving into some of these corners with me today. My one question I always ask everybody is, like, if you could go back in time 10 years, what's the one piece of advice that you would give yourself back then?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if I were to give my younger self advice now, it would be to really just deepen into my self-regard, and to I don't know, seek out mentors, or to have surrounded myself with the people who are going to lift me up and also show me how to better do that internal work of really loving myself and valuing myself as a person and regarding myself in a way that that would set me up for more success, because that was a long journey to, and I didn't have those foundations growing up. And so then, that's what I would share with my younger self, is just learn to love yourself and be kind to yourself and just accept yourself.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
So 44 minutes in, I'm going, thank you again for this. This has been a great conversation, and there's been so many gems that have been dropped along the way. This is the goal of the Conversation With series, is to provide somebody with, that's watching it going, I'm in the middle of my journey, and get a gem from Sue going, there is hope and there is work to be done and there's some good stuff. So Sue, please keep up all the great work, and I look forward to our future conversations.
Thank you so much, Gene. It's always lovely to chat with you.
Oh, yes. All right, everybody. This has been episode 25 of Peeled's LiveCast Conversations With series. Until next week, we'll talk to you then.
Bye.